Can you hear us, Krista, now? Sorry, I'm wondering.
Yeah, can actually, as we've only just started, apologies to everyone in the room, but can we just go from the top?
Yeah,
because
no problem.
we are recording this.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine.
I'm really sorry.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Okay, so yeah, the topic of my paper today is The White Season, a short season of documentary and drama programming broadcast by the BBC in 2008, which, according to Commissioner of Factual Programming at the time, Richard Klein, had the aim of readdressing a supposed balance in British politics and culture by giving a voice to the silenced white working class population of Britain. So the first question, why return to a season that only ran for just over a week 15 years ago? And I hope, as will become clear, the legacy of the White Season still is certainly with us in the post-Brexit era, but it does also have a continuing social and political significance as asserted by sociologists, critical whiteness scholars, and within wider cultural studies, which is situated the season as a kind of nodal point in this crystallization of neoliberal, neo-assimilationist narratives of class, race, immigration, and nation, which adhere around this supposed narrative of historical victimhood, specifically attributed to Britain's white working class. So the emergence of these narratives on flagship BBC programming is clearly significant to the scholarship. And the White Season is often actually kind of referenced as the moment in British culture where white working class becomes a kind of prominent term. However, having said this, the scholarship doesn't in fact pay much attention to the context of PSB. It's not interested in the White Season's part of ongoing debates around public service, and it entirely ignores the context of the programme's broadcast, the content, sorry, of the programme's broadcast. In contrast, this paper sets out to explore how the discursive meanings and boundaries of whiteness and white working classness are shaped by the contested normative paradigms associated with PSB. Specifically, I'm attending to a tension overlooked in sociological scholarship, wherein diversity discourses intersect with the representation of what is held at the same time to be a majoritarian identity in Britain. So, next slide, please. The main question organising this paper is how does white emerge out of a public service paradigm which situates cultural diversity and minority representation as a key principle. And methodologically, I'm asserting that we approach this question through three sub-related fields: policy, promotion, programmes. Policy actually kind of extends beyond. It's also some legal documents, some annual reports, but we all kind of love an alliterative framework. And each level of this is going to include three kind of qualitative textual analysis, three layers of qualitative textual analysis. So I hope to show the kind of complexities of whiteness which operate through these various levels of the public service paradigm. Next slide, please. Great. Before we get into things properly, it's worth definitely quickly defining how I'm using diversity, which is on one hand in line with the normative definitions guiding policymakers. This is a definition from the European Broadcasting Union, but is also cognizant about debates around how this has been slowly redefined in an increasingly marketized public service ecology, namely through this kind of increasing blurring with plurality, the plurality of different voices, of different kind of viewing options, which, as Braun and Crosson argue, is actually often comes into tension with universality, this notion of public service broadcasting as being a kind of shared cultural space for shared cultural representation. Furthermore, these notions of diversity line with Sarita Malik, and I swear I didn't know she was keynoting this when I wrote this paper. Sarita Malik's historicisation of creative diversity with its post-racial meritocratic underpinnings, and Malik's work has constantly kind of questioned the blindness of this notion of diversity to the sort of politics of representation. Next slide, please. So a bit more on the White Season. Broadcast on BBC Two for 1 week in March 2008, the White Season was promoted as a cultural intervention into the effects of globalisation, mass immigration and economic upheaval. As the list of programmes indicate, the White Season was pitched as part of an interest in growing nationalist politics and a backlash against the apparent failures of multiculturalism. You have the programme covering the BNP, for instance, which this is a moment where in the following year they'll win their first kind of council seat in Burnley. And within wider scholarship, the white season is a key cultural marker of the emergent white working class categorization. However, in contrast to these foundational theorizations of whiteness, going back to Richard Dyer's seminal work in which the white racial imaginary is marked by invisibility, normativity, connotations of essential and essential human subjectivity, the white working class ostensibly foregrounds a marked invisible whiteness in its construction of identity. And scholarly reaction to the white season has understood this visibility as problematic. Next slide, please. So there's two main narratives of how kind of sociology and cultural studies have approached the white season. The first understands the season as an articulation of what James Rhodes calls white backlash, which claims the kind of historical victimhood of white people and sees this as a moment to reassert, recenter and reassert white subjectivity. Next slide, please. And to sort of quickly illustrate how the season plays into this, I've included a short clip of an advert that preceded the white season, which is kind of infamous. It's maybe the most commented upon thing, more than the programs themselves. So it's only about, yeah.
Bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear of clouds unrolled. Bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from hand to fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
I don't think I need to sort of break down the symbol. But for later on, maybe it's worth, as I sort of get into the textuality, this visual logic of whiteness serving to actually kind of mark the subject, perhaps more than the racialization of the hands, which is clearly an objectivity. So, next slide, please. Sorry, I'm going to go through this. I think there's about 20 of these. So the second narrative around the season relates to the classism inherent within a category of white working class. A reading perhaps most known and attributed to Owen Jones's book Chaps, which situates the white season within a wider process of pejorative stereotyping of the working class in neoliberal Britain, and which Jones and many others have associated with the underclass label during the period of New Labour and coalition governments. Next slide, please. Furthermore, Stephanie Lawler's kind of developed this argument by talking about extreme whiteness and bringing the concept of visibility into question. In Lawler's reading, the act of making whiteness visible is not defensive towards the working class, but rather a strategy of highlighting their extreme and unsuitable model of whiteness. That is, the hegemony of whiteness as an ideal subject is maintained through the assumed invisibility of the middle class white viewer, the unmarked white viewer. So the white working class here embodies an improper white subjectivity to reassert the symbolic value of middle classness. Now, I think these are both prescient interpretations of the white season. I'm certainly not going to argue that it's not a work written over with classist and racist meaning. However, these two camps of scholarship, although they emphasize different aspects of racist and classist ideologies, there's a sort of clear agreement in how they understand the season and the cultural production of these ideologies. And that's the consensus I find in need of further nuance. In both cases, this is a hegemony which is relatively singular in its composition, attributed to a middle class, a sort of white middle class hegemony. Next slide, please. However, Stuart Hall's work repeatedly teaches us hegemony is complex, particularly as it pertains to media. Specifically, as Hall has argued, the ideals of public service in British television cannot simply be framed as a deceptive front for an underlying agenda, but should be thought about as a complex field where racist and classist discourses encounter various normative, industrial, and professional principles. We see the potential oversight of this approach into the white season in terms of diversity. Diversity is frequently read in opposition to the politics of the white season, either in terms of the season representing a backlash against multiculturalism, or, as Jones argues, a kind of liberal bigotry. But the notion of diversity as it exists as a core normative value of public service broadcasting in Britain is unacknowledged, and so are the tensions around this. Next slide, please. So, as I said, I'm approaching this through a holistic framework of textual analysis, policy, promotion, programs. Next slide. And I was thinking how best to promote this in a 20-minute presentation. I sort of promised holistic, and I was like, oh god, I've got to condense holistic down. So this may appear a little bit deterministic, and please let me know if it does come off that way, but I've chosen to cover promotion and policy together, and to pick out what I've noted as 3 kind of key thematic discourses which make up the field within which whiteness around the season is constructed. And these are the main texts I've chosen. The policy is fairly straightforward, as they are the sort of key policy texts that are repeatedly mentioned in sociology and cultural studies. The promotion is sort of key policy and regulatory documents around the same time, but as we'll see, there's a kind of clear historical context stretching back to the sort of Peacock Committee, the marketisation of public service media. Next slide, please. So the first theme that is apparent is a reflectionist definition of BBC's role in representing diversity. Embedded within the Royal Charter as one of BBC's 6 public purposes, the BBC's remit involves an understanding of broadcasting as strengthening an existing cultural diversity, but often simply just through making it visible on our screens. Unsurprisingly, given the BBC's other obligations towards impartiality, there is little in the way of how to interpret or position diversity as a notion. It seems to exist somewhat transparently. Next slide. Thank you. This is again the idea of plurality arising. More voices are good, which is not something I would argue against, but it contains little detail of how the BBC should mediate these voices and mediate the diversity it's representing. Next slide, please. This reflectionist attitude in the promotion, and here is the article by Richard Klein in the Daily Mail, this becomes very apparent in the promotion. In Klein's article, we already see a major problem with assuming transparency because the constitution of white working class as a transparent category is repeatedly problematized by its conflation with working classness itself. The potential for opposite or contradictory histories of working class identity in Britain are smothered by a rhetorical slippage between white and working class. This reflectionist attitude provides a rhetorical frame in the promotion whereby questions of structural privilege are never justified. Next slide, please. And this closely ties to a second theme of the white season, which is its construction of a public sphere. Obviously, the kind of Habermasian notion of broadcasting as fostering a public sphere is central to PSB's foundational normative mission, promoting diversity and universality by operating as a space in which difference is brought into the home, as well as functioning as a public domain in which common concerns are raised. In practice, though, as Des Freeman has argued, the reality of the contemporary conception of the public sphere paradigms are heavily marketized ones, and we have to think about the debates around the 2003 Broadcasting Act, which, love of God, is still the main legal document for broadcasting, where scholars become increasingly anxious about the conflation of citizen and consumer as terms, whereby public services, the public sphere is recast merely as a collection of individual consumers making individual consumption choices. We see in the policy documents, and this is the sort of green paper leading up to the Royal Charter in 2007, where accomplishing diversity is often related simply to meeting the needs and interests of the audience, which raises again, I think, BBC's positionality. This is not to critique the BBC trying to be impartial or to call for a paternalistic Reithian model again, but within white season itself, the construction of the public sphere often has the effect of reimposing normative whiteness in how social and historical change is narrated. Next slide, please. Fine. So the Newsnight episode is a particular culprit of this. This was a Newsnight episode that came out the week before White Season, where they have Nick Griffin on, because Nick Griffin is all over BBC News programming at this point in time. And we see countless interviews. It's in Derbyshire, I think they centre it around, where people are given kind of free rein to say how they feel England has changed. It's no longer their country. Someone said, oh, my community doesn't look the same anymore, and it scares me. Those were actually words said. All of these interviews are shaping a narrative of social decline inevitably linked to immigration. Next slide, please. And similarly, this is from Richard Klein's article. Sorry, I didn't cite it here. Richard Klein's construction of a public sphere in the Daily Mail article relies on centering white experience and white working class experience, erasing Britain's colonial history entirely. Klein reifies multiculturalism as this kind of external project which has happened to Britain's white working class and changed things in this country. Next slide, please. And so the last theme in policy promotion that I want to label is what I've sort of called provocation and reach, a category which may be a little bit more mystifying in terms of a normative justification, but speaks poignantly perhaps to the political economy which actually underpins the White Season's production. Notable in the shift from White Season's promotion to the reflection in the BBC annual report in 2008 is that the success of the season is now framed by the terminology of provoking debate. These are the only times, by the way, in the entire annual report, even though the White Season's hailed as a major success, it only gets 3 references in that year's annual report. A cynic might say that provocation is a term really as kind of damage control after there was massive controversy around the racism and classism of their season. And it is an interesting term, not one immediately connected to public service values. But what I think is equally revealing is the couching of provocative as a positive quality for sustaining the BBC's presence or reach in an increasingly competitive online digital marketplace. Provocation is constantly tied to reaching people on different platforms. The annual report as a whole, next slide please, and this is also the green paper as well, which preceded the Royal Charter, is kind of littered to references with how the problem of the BBC negotiating universality, reaching all its viewers, with trying to reach people on digital and online platforms. And it shows an increasingly complex media ecosystem that the BBC is trying to negotiate. So how public service content reaches people in this ecosystem is a clear and obvious anxiety. And I think provocative gestures to this backdrop of anxiety around the waning legitimation of public service broadcasting. So I think these 3 thematic discourses, reflectiveness, sustaining a public sphere, provoking audiences, I've been thinking about these a lot, and I've come to my interpretation. This is the deterministic bit, please let me know if I'm overstepping the interpretation here, of the role of whiteness as a technology in relation to White Season, a technology that is a cultural power but also economic pragmatism. Specifically, I constantly get this feeling that White Season is partly born out of this negotiation of mass reach and diverse representation, and whiteness is something that can function as national subject, the history of England, as well as diverse object for the BBC to reach both of these objectives. So that's my hypothesis so far. But how does it manifest in the programme? Next slide. Still okay?
Yeah,
not too much more, 2 or 3 pages. Great. So the programme I'm focusing on today is White Girl. And I'm happy to discuss other texts if anyone has any questions about the Not Powell documentaries. If they're interested in that thing, I'm not, but I can discuss it. I've chosen White Girl as the demonstrative case study because it's actually revealing of what gets ignored with the White Season. It's almost entirely ignored in the promotion. Klein's article in Daily Mail doesn't mention the drama series. And if you go on Wikipedia, White Season is called a season of documentary, which it's not. This is a drama. So we might infer that the White Girl's generic status, the single play, or what he calls the serious drama, sits kind of awkwardly with this reflectionist framing of documentary. And at the same time, I think it's evaded scholarly attention because the narrative is more difficult to fit into white backlash. far from creating a picture of white victimhood. Next slide, please. And this is the only mention I can find of white girl from a former employee of the BBC and ongoing knobhead, Rod Liddell. So, far from creating a picture of white victimhood, the plot seemingly centres positive and potentially convivial multicultural and multi-ethnic interaction. The drama involves a mother called Debbie and her 3 children fleeing from an abusive drug-dealing husband and relocating to the predominantly white neighbourhood in Leeds. From a predominantly white neighbourhood to an entirely Muslim street in inner-city Bradford. The plot centres on the daughter Leia and how she becomes increasingly accepting of the Muslim community. Initially ignorant of their beliefs and customs, she finds friendship and solace in Muslim school friends, neighbours, and the local imam. Next slide, please. These are sort of positive figures in the narrative. The growing acceptance culminates in her wearing a hijab and attending prayers at the mosque, and the drama ends with her mother Debbie divorcing the abusive husband and then collectively beginning to build a more positive home in this community. And so as this synopsis suggests, it doesn't kind of easily fit white backlash discourses. And at face value feels difficult to recuperate into this picture of white seasons politics that I've been sketching. Perhaps then it's not surprising that Rod Liddell's article is the only thing I could really find written about it beyond blog posts from 2008 and forum discussions. For Liddell, the drama's picture of multiculturalism is one which champions Muslim values as a route to achieve working class progress, and that's a reading I fundamentally disagree with, and I think it has a much more uncertain, contradictory construction of identification. I want to cycle through these because there's like 4 more slides, but it's just like one scene. So this is the scene which I want to talk about very briefly to just sort of recap finally. This scene is early on in the play, in the drama, in which the family drive through Bradford for the first time, and director Hetty MacDonald captures this moment through an ambivalent series of point of view and reaction shots, as we see Debbie and Leia look out with some mix of bewilderment and distaste intercut with the various sights and sounds of the Muslim Bradford community they're entering into. The way this scene is shot complicates any neat distinction between us or them, either in terms of race and class, and I mean us or them in terms of the audience's identification, as we are guided to both adopt and bracket the racially antagonistic gaze of the white working class family through the sharp reverse shot editing, even as we invite it to clearly see the character's gaze as racist, and attribute it to their whiteness perhaps, or their extreme whiteness, as Stephanie Lawler would say. The point of view shots nevertheless foster a racializing logic. We see the community and these people as other, as the family do, appearing as a disorientating and alienating moment in time and space, or perhaps as object, the object which inspires the racist gaze. So the point of view and logic of identification in this sequence is uncertain and contradictory, existing somewhere between prejudicial examination of extreme whiteness and a genuine identification with the experience of white dispossession, which provides a genuine place-making function. So this vacillating, contradictory nature of the drama's points of identification resist an easy reading of the classist, racist, or even liberal politics. And without saying that this racial representation is just an extension of this uncertain moment in the BBC in their point of this media ecosystem, I do think it suggests an incoherence and contradictoriness that feels like it's a part of this context somehow. Anyway, next slide, please. And this is next. I'm wrapping. So to very quickly conclude, how does white emerge out of this public service paradigm? Across both policy and promotion, we've seen whiteness functions potentially discursively as subject and object. I've tried to understand this discursive function within a policy and regulatory context. And finally, to turn to the text, I think I found a similarly contradictory construction of race and class subjectivity missed by the scholarship. However, it's important to note the limitations, and this is me just signal boosting. If anyone knows anyone involved in white season at the BBC at this moment in time, that's the next step of this project. To be fully holistic, I kind of really need to get a sense of the production decisions, there's a lot that I don't understand just from discourse analysis, but that's where I'm at so far. So thank you.
Thank you. Now,
Do you want me to take the middle there?
that would be wonderful. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to share your slides.
I've got some annoying things with it.
Yeah.
Ones to go through as well. Sorry. I think there's 12 slides.
And is this yours?
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And is everybody seeing and hearing? Can you just double check that for me?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, that looks like it's still happening. Brilliantly. So, without further ado, if you want to introduce yourself and we'll hear about your paper.
Okay, hi, I'm Chris Roberts. I'm a senior lecturer in TV production at the University of Creative Arts. I've only had that job for 12 months. Prior to that, I worked at Roehampton for 17 years, and I taught TV studies, media cultural studies. I taught a lot of journalism. That's important because there's some journalism references here, stuff about news and the notion of primary definers features. Okay, so yeah, so I'm aware of the audience I'm speaking to, so I don't need to meander through the work of John Fisk, John Hartley, or Charlotte Bronte. Annette Hill, Jane Foyer, Roger Silverstone. Sorry if I've forgotten anyone obvious. So I don't need to go through that, though I'm going to reference Annette Hill a couple of times. And Stuart Hall, I've already heard Stuart Hall reference today. Also, I've never heard anyone refer to what we use the term ongoing knobhead in a presentation, and I'm here for that.
I hadn't written that down, it was just inspiration.
Well, it was very inspirational. I loved it. Ongoing knobhead, it was great. Anyway, so yeah, I don't need to meander through all that, but I guess what I want to, the thing I will start to do at least is to explain the vitality and importance of television, but I think that's probably also self-evident to people in the room, so that television remains arguably the most widely consumed form of expression and is a crucial element of storytelling and most important element of discourse, ideology and the reproduction of hegemony is, I think, probably self-evident to most of us in the room. However, consider all that, in the context of this paper, it's important I'm going to try and define, albeit very briefly, a few main elements that hopefully contextualise the wider parameters and explain what I want this paper to demonstrate. So there are 3 or 4 things I want to very briefly define are the genre of this, not the genre as a whole, but the genre of this programme. So my programme, as you can see there, is called Council House Crackdown. And has anyone seen Council House Crackdown? It's an ongoing BBC show, and the ongoing nature of it is quite important. And there's a lot of resources devoted to it, and I think it's a very problematic text. So I'm going to look at the genre that Council House Crackdown is and the claims made for it, and the claims made for it by the BBC, how that genre characterisation sets or frames the discursive template, and then how that might allow me to make broader ideological claims about it. The other thing I'm going to look at is the notion of primary definers, which is coined really by Stuart Hall, et al. Stuart Hall gets all the credit, but it's a book written by about 6 people. Stuart Hall, rightly, I think, gets lots of the credit. So the notion of primary definers and the ways in which sources, as primary definers, are able to make ideological, socio-political knowledge claims, and the ways in which their positioning and legitimacy via forms of TV and TV representation produces or reproduces hegemony. In light of Ekstrom's central point, so in my abstract, I begin by talking about Max Ekstrom and his central point about television being remarkably good at doing certain things and not so good at doing other things. I'm going to examine the extent to which I agree with that. Largely I do, but I think there's also slight problems with it. So in light of that, I'll sketch out what I think the main television repertoires are for storytelling. In my mind, namely, they are dramatic codes and conventions, best exemplified maybe by archetypes, stereotypes, and characterization. All of these dramatic elements help to shape the narrative orientation, and I would suggest that is even the case in non-dramatic, high-modality forms, non-fiction forms like documentary, current affairs, and fact-ent, so factual entertainment, which of course is now a sort of dominant genre, and a lot of resources devoted to that. My claim is that even in documentary, it's in its contemporary iteration, and current affairs and fact-ent, dramatic codes and conventions are absolutely essential to storytelling, and those conventions are really about characterisation, archetypes and stereotypes. It's massively the case in Panorama, by the way. This isn't a paper about Panorama. That was my PhD. Panorama just basically uses drama to tell stories, which in some ways is really interesting and positive, and the way in which it's done is deeply problematic. And briefly, class, I'm not going to define class fully, we're all conversant with that, but class has in the past, of course, referred narrowly to social differences between people and the kind of work that they do, but that's obviously a little reductive. And in this case, I think class is clearly demarcated by one's proximity to housing, which I think this text is all about. So what this amounts to is I need to sort of sketch out the mode of representation first that this text employs or employs, or what genre it is. So the form this particular TV text actually is. So is it current affairs? Is it current affairs broadcasting? In which case, because it's on the BBC, if it's current affairs, then it's sort of seemingly locked into the BBC's discursive logic of balance and impartiality and the necessity the BBC feels with regards to politics representation. Is it documentary? In the old kind of established meaning of the term documentary. Documentary being different slightly to current affairs. It lacks the currency necessarily of current affairs. Documentary practices are generically licensed, I suppose, to explore issues on a kind of longer form, but from a longer time ago. It doesn't have to have the currency of current affairs. So documentary can include a wider contextual focus. Or is it, in fact, rather more elastic contemporary manifestation of documentary current affairs, now to be found in the dominant, relatively well-resourced genre of factual entertainment, sometimes referred to as fact-ent? So what is it, and why is this demarcation, this discursive televisual categorisation important? To answer that, at least the first of these, what it is, we can turn first to how the BBC itself defines this particular form. So here we go. How does the BBC position this text? Which genre? As you can see, if you can press one more, we will get another. There we go. So this is the genre. So as you can see, the BBC self-identifies Council House Crackdown, extraordinary name for a programme, in the genre of factual and crime and justice. There's a term to use. And in terms of the format, that's reality. So they're differentiating here. So it's interesting that they're differentiating between genre and format, which I think is quite interesting in itself. Can we go to the next slide? So they differentiate rightly, I think, genre from format. Genre is the classification based on content, say it's drama or news or game show or whatever, and format, the way information is organised and presented. So to take the first term, genre, the BBC self-defines this text as factual, so far sort of uncontroversial. I might come back to it though, but also as crime and justice. This is an interesting iteration insofar as the Times, crime and justice carry certain ideological, institutional, discursive, but also genre weights in the television landscape. It's also an important distinction because of the format, right? So the format, potentially discarding some of the legitimacy claims made for the designation factual. So the term reality, we know that reality texts are sort of problematic in how we read. You don't, even though a casual TV viewer is aware of the problematic nature and the claims made for the term reality, something referring to television. So what we end up with is sort of hybrid text. So we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, Annette Hill. So we end up with sort of hybrid text. So as Annette Hill says, factual television is a container for a variety of genres, subgenres, hybrid genres. The term factual is shorthand for non-fiction content. It is a useful term that instantly states this television programme is fact and not fiction. It's also, crucially, a value-laden term, and its association with truth, information, and other conceptual values ensures it means different things to different people. So as Annette Hill has outlined, it's now a fairly dominant genre. So not only is it dominant, but its hybridity is increasingly relevant. So again, as Annette Hill explains, I think it's the next slide. I might have messed that up, but I think it is. It is. Annette Hill explains, contemporary factual TV describes a topsy-turvy world. It is a space where familiar factual genres such as news or documentary take on properties common to other genres. Factual TV genres have to incorporate entertainment values, which I think is one of my key elements, because it refers back to the dominant television repertoires. So they take on entertainment values in order to compete in a competitive TV landscape. So traditional factual TV genres such as current affairs, science and history TV, made a whole range of changes from the people presenting these programmes to the use of new technology, and especially the type of content these programmes now include, which I think will come up when I show you a brief clip of Council House Crackdown. So So the kind of presenters that are presenting this, that are fronting it, are slightly different to how they used to be. So the next slide, I think it's pretty brief, yes. So for the purpose of this paper, I'll categorise Counterhouse Crackdown as a hybrid genre. It owes a debt to reality format in terms of its organisation of content and some of its styles and modes of representative presentation, its presenter and the technology of production. But it's also indebted in part to the current affairs genre and its subject matter, and in terms of knowledge and the discourse claims it wishes to make of itself. So it's kind of related to all of these different genres, but it's really emerging as a sort of fact-end programme. But it still makes claims about its legitimacy precisely because the genre is factual, okay? But it's adopting the modes of representation of the reality format. So one of the reasons I make the claims about current affairs genre is based on its use of particular sources and the ways in which these sources are used, which brings me to my second key point, which is about primary definition, primary definers, which brings me neatly, hopefully, to that definition. So I'll begin with our friend Stuart Hall. So the next slide, please. So Stuart Hall says these professional rules, so professional rules in journalism he's referring to, but we can extend that to this text. Professional rules give rise to the practice of ensuring that media statements are, wherever possible, grounded in objective, authoritative statements from accredited sources. This means constantly turning to accredited representatives of major social institutions. In attempting to fulfil public interest aims and present authoritative accounts, positively, I think, I always leave that word out, they seek out those who already appear knowledgeable, authoritative, or representative. As such, they reinforce as well as reflect power imbalances by awarding such primary definers greater visibility and legitimacy. This becomes obvious why I've said this a bit later on, hopefully it is. So primary definers, as you'd expect from the term, primarily define the discourse, the narrative orientation. Along these lines, and related more explicitly to television and to my own interest in the narrative orientation of this paper, Andrew Chadwick, who's recently done lots and lots of great work on the notion of primary definers, they posed the following question. I don't think I've got a quote for this. Can we check? Yeah. No, I haven't. That's obviously purpose. Purpose. So I haven't got a quote for this. I'll have to read it out. So I should have put it up on the thing. But this is Andrew Chadwick et al. Talking about primary definers in a particularly interesting way. How does the medium of television, so this quote, how does the medium of television give voice to people from different social classes? Who has the opportunity to appear and speak on television? To whom do they speak, and under what circumstances does this communication occur? End quote. So the means to which television gives voice or does not to specific social classes and the circumstances of that speech is quite key in the context of my textual sample, which is Counterhouse Crackdown. In this text, as I hope to demonstrate, certain protagonists are cast and legitimated social political actors, whilst others are not only able to carry the weight of institutional authority, but in terms of the discourse and specificities of the television form, to function via, this is another quote, authority signalling, which is the term Chadwick uses, via authority signalling as the more heroic central protagonists, while others, in both senses of the term, are cast as deviant subjectivities. Which now brings me to the third of four things I'm going to define the classes in a tiny way. So I'm going to talk about television repertoire, so the codes and conventions of TV that we're all used to, and it's the case even in these factual genres that they use drama. So it brings me not accidentally to TV's dominant repertoire of representational techniques. TV texts deploy or make use of a range of discursive repertoires. These are mostly drawn from the canon of TV drama. To a large extent, this is, if not laudable or such, but it is at least understandable. TV, after all, has to make sense. So the next slide is the quote from Thorne and Purvis. Television must give explanations of the real in forms of narratives which will shape the disorder of reality into forms which are recognisable, meaningful and safe. Forms, in other words, which comply with the requirements of cultural and generic verisimilitude. The generic verisimilitude referenced here by Thorne and Purvis refers to the genre of TV drama. I should clarify, I'm not suggesting that Counterhouse Crackdown is pitched explicitly as drama, meaning that it uses those techniques. So it uses some of those characteristics. In some ways, of course, this is relevant to the classic narrative structure of Todorov and the classic characterisation, also documented by Vladimir Prop in his discussion of folk tales. So the fourth thing I'm going to quickly look at is the notion of class. Before I'm going to show you a quick clip and then try and do some brief analysis. So the notion of class needs some brief definition, particularly in the context of this paper and this sample text. So as I already stated, class has in the past referred narrowly to social differences between people and the kind of work they do. However, this is too narrow and delimiting. Often now, thanks to the work of sociologists, people like Pierre Bourdieu, and in the kind of television and sociology field, someone like Bev Skeggs, who is an outstanding scholar of TV and class. Class is often taken to indicate variation in social status, levels of education, and lifestyle. But in our case, social status is key, and it's clearly signified by their relationship to property. In this particular TV text, it's their relationship to property that is signifying their class and signifying their subjectivity in relation. So, what are my example council house crackdown? So the next slide, I'm not going to read this out because this is what Shine TV, this is what they put up on their website, and this is what the BBC puts up of what council house crackdown will be about. But you can see some of the things I put in italics and bold and underlined. Crackdown on road tenants, the grip of the housing crisis, every social housing property is given to someone in genuine need, etc., etc., etc. Rooting out brazen tenancy cheats. You can see the discourse that's being mobilised here. One of the issues here is, of course, this is the BBC and they have public service obligation, but what they're doing is, I think, just reproducing a kind of dominant rhetoric and neoliberal logic when, one would hope for something better, even after lots and lots of exposure to this and examples of the BBC never really doing that much better. I always kind of hope that they do, but then they do this. So I think next slide, I'm going to play a quick clip. Okay, so this is, I think this is, series 2, episode 3. I could have used almost any one, right? But this is the opening sort of 3 minutes, so it's like the front page. So if we just play that.
I'm Michelle Ackerley. My parents both grew up on council estates, and as a family, we understand the difference social housing can make to people's lives. But across the UK, there's a chronic shortage of council and housing association homes.
I know so many friends and so many people that just literally don't have anywhere to live.
Adding to the crisis, some tenants are abusing the system, holding onto properties they no longer need, or even worse, unlawfully subletting them and coining in a small fortune.
Subletting social housing is wrong. It's wrong, it's illegal, and it's wrong.
So every day we'll be with the housing investigators as they crack down on those rogue tenants.
And you got bare lives.
Reclaim properties.
Anybody here?
And give them to families in genuine need.
All of those keys are yours. Oh, don't, because you'll start me off again.
This is Council House Crackdown.
A tiny bit.
Our reporter, property expert Luke Doonan, also grew up on a council estate. And for the last 6 months, he's been working alongside dedicated housing investigators who will stop at nothing to track down every single tenant who's abusing the system. Today, we join a team of fraud investigators as one case of suspected subletting has them racing around East London.
We can get the police here to arrest you.
They have lied under caution, so we'll just call the police now.
We find out how one woman's shocking use of someone else's identity helped to defraud Lambeth Council out of a tenancy and claim over £150,000 in benefits.
She didn't flinch, and that did leave me feeling fairly cold about the whole matter.
And a council tenant who should have been living in Greenwich, but was discovered 700 miles away.
We received an anonymous tip-off to say that Mr. Omar was now living in Norway.
Tenancy fraud costs the public purse an estimate.
Okay. So to do some brief analysis of that. I think one of the things I've left out, which I'm now going to throw in, but just very briefly. So in the actual paper that I'm trying to write for publication, I also reference music, but I haven't done it here. Because one of the things we all know from watching TV news is news doesn't include music, because music is this kind of guide and driver of mood and things like that. Strangely, when I was doing my PhD, I discovered that Panorama does use music. So Current Affairs does, which I think is very controversial, and John Corner has written brilliantly about the use of music in documentary, and also in Current Affairs, although not much in Current Affairs. There's about 2 or 3 people that have written about that, and I happen to be one of them, and no one knows who I am. Fair enough. But yeah, the use of music as well is really interesting. in high modality forms that are claiming to represent something real. But the music is so clearly a signifier of how we're going to respond to that text. It's extraordinary. Anyway, so the programme begins with a heartfelt, genuine and true account of the value of social housing, right? No problem with that. After the initial opening 1 minute, it transforms into the kind of benefit fraud tropes, televisively juxtaposing the fraudsters with those in desperate need of social housing. It's emotionally resonant and a classic of the TV form. The opening minute, the front page, strongly suggests the programme is concerned that those in need of social housing are being denied it. That's true. I don't deny that Michelle Ackley is concerned with that at all. But how does the programme address the genuine social housing needs? Given the lengthy, detailed nature of the investigation, this one is episode 3 of a 10-part series. I think we're into series 5 now. It may have been stopped, it may have been decommissioned now, but the first season was 6 episodes long and 45 minutes. By the time we get to season 3 and 4, it's 10 episodes long and it's an hour. So there's a lot of resources devoted to this programme. It was like a regular thing. It was on BBC 2, something they moved to BBC 1. Council House Crackdown was prime time viewing, and the BBC kind of included it in their news and current affairs output. And I think that's a problem. Anyway, so the BBC clearly has the resources, right, with which to undertake some serious investigative journalism and TV journalism. Given the resources, the prime time scheduling, the concern of the programme makers is purportedly oriented around addressing the sanitary housing crisis, perhaps the most urgent housing crisis in the UK. Why is the discourse of the show so narrow and problematic? Televisionally, and also journalistically, the approach goes after easy targets, right? It gains easy access to court documents. If you're an investigative journalist, that's relatively speaking easy work to do. These people will happily give you their information. So that's relatively easy work journalistically. Crucially, it fails to address the issue the programme rather emotionally purports to be concerned with. Sense of drama and suspense is heightened and intensified by tension-building techniques, classic of the dramatic repertoire, cast and marked against the legitimated primary definers. So the people they speak to, the sources, they're the primary definers. The people who are defrauding us, they're cast in a more deviant way. There are even moments of dramatic confrontation and denouement with partial narrative closure when the deviant subjects are confronted. So if you watch to the end, which of course we can't do today, there are moments of dramatic tension and denouement where these people are apprehended, or people are, of course this is a classic as well, we see this in lots of cop shows. So recorded action is edited together in such a way as to encourage parallels with fictionalised police procedural dramas, also of course widely available in the evening TV viewing schedules. This form of cop show drama focuses on tracking down deviant subjects, venerating the intrepid investigative prowess of the host Michelle Ackley and her assorted primary definers. In many ways, it's a classic of the TV drama repertoire, full of sensationalism, of revelations, of gathering and disseminating compelling evidence. However, footage like this leads itself to kind of voyeuristic engagement, to quote or paraphrase Patricia Hall, and they have a sort of dramatic appeal. In this text, the undercover reporter, so Michelle Ackley, but also her primary definers, become intrepid adventurers with whom the viewer is encouraged to identify. And of course, it is genre specialising in erasing political economic context, right? It's explicitly television. It locates issues at the level of individual failings as opposed to structural conditions of the neoliberal era. What's more, to at least reference one of the other key tenets of this paper, it clumsily and reductively represents class, mainly working class subjectivity. It does something quite narrow, reductive ways. It ends up doing nothing but arguably reproducing small c conservative neoliberal hegemony. The programme does not address the issue, but merely underscores and reproduces the most reactionary tendencies. Perhaps ought to clarify that this programme exists and is now long running. We've had 4 seasons. Is not necessarily in and of itself a problem. Okay. For full disclosure, I do think it's a problem, right? But there's of course room for programmes like this. But that this programme exists is not necessarily a problem, even if it's not to my taste. The problem, 2 of them, is the method of research, data gathering, and production. So that's my final proposal addresses that. But the other problem I have is the near total absence of an alternative version of this programme. There is no programme that deals with the bigger issues that they're claiming to want to deal with. There's simply no version of this programme where the sources or the primary definers are drawn from a much wider social, economic, cultural field. If you're able to devote such relatively large production resources to a programme purporting to be concerned with the current housing crisis, which is clearly real, right? We clearly have housing crisis. Why not devote time and effort and resources to making a programme that deals with, for instance, one, the 30-year experiment, now 40-year experiment in a mass sell-off of social housing, clearly located in the context of patriotic politics, property owning democracy. I'd love to see a programme that does the context for this. Why is there a housing crisis? Okay, BBC got a lot of resources. Maybe let's look at let's do a whole series of programmes that examines selling off social housing and the explicit ban imposed on local councils in 1986 from using the proceeds of those sales to rebuild more social housing. Explicitly banned in 1986. You can see it's an act of government. So the sell off social housing. Councils have all these resources because they've sold them, and Thatcher's government says that you can't use those resources to restock social housing. Or you could look at the precarious nature of employment, falling real incomes, housing in the neoliberal era. You could do a programme about that. You could do a programme about the deliberate running down and underfunding of public services. You could do all or any of the above, right? You make a programme about that, but they make this one instead. So when I said that this programme exists is not a problem, it is a problem, but I understand why it doesn't. But what I don't understand, sort of, is why there isn't a version of this programme like I've just described. Basically, almost anything, even approaching the above, would be welcome, but remains stubbornly absent. So what might the alternatives be? In truth, the discourse informs are so well established that even to attempt an alternative approach is potentially replete with problems. Where any alternative or subaltern or counter-hegemonic critical discursive means employed to tell these stories, this form is so well established and so well entrenched, and perhaps, to borrow from Gramsci, so commonsensical, is of the standard forms of television fact-ended storytelling. To explain the rationale for an entire different semiotic, lexical, discursive choice might necessitate an entire series of broadcasts, and of course the BBC would be castigated for doing so. However, I maintain that the standard and standard-bearer forms of high-modality television storytelling practices must be radically shifted in favour of forms that locate contemporary issues in their wider ideological, geopolitical, discursive, social and historical context. In short, in order to fully tell the story, or in this case the housing crisis, and inform the public, this genre of television storytelling in particular could shift away from the overly dramatic and instead return to an approach that relocates issues and events in their wider social, historical and ideological context. The problem here is, am I suggesting a return to a sort of John Grierson, sort of Griersonian mode of documentary practice? Because John Grierson is rightly credited here, but for my money, his sister Ruby Grierson's documentary Housing Problems is perhaps the parallel, right? Because she talks to people at the sharp end being affected by housing problems. So Ruby Grierson's Housing Problems is a fantastic documentary, I recommend. It's available on YouTube. But we need that kind of storytelling template. Regardless, we could make the case for return to such form. So we could say, yeah, let's return to sort of Grierson mode of what documentary is. It might be possible, might even be preferable. Whatever form it takes, it needs to be a form of distance from, I think, the fact-end of production. However, the issue with that is that in some ways a fully embraced return to this Griersonian mode, one in which the social context is located or placed at and as the central organising principle, the central motif, seems if we return to Ekstrom's thesis, with which I sort of began, it's there in my abstract, to partially discard that which gives television its discursive, persuasive storytelling power, namely personal stories. Personal stories are the driver of TV, right? So returning to a sort of Grierson mode and locating the social instead of the personal is probably replete with a few problems. I think we ought to do something, but maybe a return to Grierson is not necessarily what we need. So to wrap up, I begin stumbling towards an end and to address Ekstrom's central thesis. Is it true that television, because it, to quote Grierson, lends itself to aesthetically appealing and dramatic representations, and is less appropriate for logical and factual argumentation, discriminating depictions of reality in in-depth analysis? Is that the case? In short, is it television's TV-ness that means these kind of programmes are the dominant ones and we can't do my alternative suggestion? Or might there be a way to harness television's inbuilt capacity for personal stories to reorient and reframe wider social and political issues, perhaps in a more progressive, even counter-hegemonic direction? So how might that work? Perhaps an alternative might be something like as follows. If, as contemporary trends suggest, the latest iteration of television documentary or fact and storytelling Increasingly, it does focus on the personal, utilising dramatic frames in order to tell stories. And if contemporary factual television practice, exemplified here in some ways by Crackdown, continues to shift the genre and the form towards the fact end of the spectrum, utilising the practice of discourse of the personal and dramatic, and relying on legitimated primary definers, then it will need to cast
Estimated £1.8 billion each year.
I'm going to make a claim about my own politics now. If we, on the progressive left are to utilise the power of television storytelling, perhaps then it's not so much that drama, character, emotive representation are present, but who are, to quote Bev Skeggs, who are the subjects of value, afforded time, space, depth, interiority, character, and that have some impact, even partial, on the unfolding narrative. One of the things that continuing defeats of people with my politics teaches us is in fact that facts, challenges, fact checks, statistics and data, while important, even vital, do not on their own necessarily win ideological victories. Which underscores my pessimism with regard to return to the career sewing moment documentary form. In fact, if defeat teaches us anything, then it is character, narrative and stories that win hearts and minds. It is television storylines and narratives that shape the political and ideological terrain, in which case, in order to provide the necessary wider contextual detail, the contemporary television documentary, current affairs, fact-end form, will need to feature a much wider and greater plurality of voices. As documented by Georgina Vaughan in her seminal text about the BBC, if the BBC are serious about plurality and multiplicity, then a radical transformation as to who the primary definers are will be necessary. I think it's the last slide now. It's a quote from me. So, if, even in documentary, fact-end broadcasting, we are to learn about the world through increasingly archetypal characters drawn within dramatised frames, then those featured characters must be garnered from a much more diverse social, political, cultural and economic field. A more diverse repertoire of voices and characters must be used. In short, a wider coalition of social, political, ideological, cultural, counter-hegemonic identity forms must be sought out and represented. And their subsequent place in the discourse or storylines must become more centralised. So my elevator pitch is, it's not television's TV-ness necessarily, it's the sources that are used that are given the legitimacy of primarily defining the discourse. TV can do really wonderful things, but for some reason it's not doing it in my analysis of this text. Thanks, I'm done.
Thank you.
I didn't even ask how I was doing the time.
You were doing fine.
Was that okay?
Yes, that was great. I will unshare the sharing. So we've got, just so everyone can have a comfort break before the end of the day event with Meter. Have we got any questions for those two very interesting papers? Yeah.
Do you want to go first? Well,
I think you were first.
Oh, was I?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for both those papers. Really interesting. So for Dan, I was just wondering where, because I think that's quite, I don't know why, but Stephen Lawrence came into my head, and you know, like the reviews and things that were going on, and I know that reviews were largely focused on the Met, but kind of running a program like that or like a season like that when Stephen Lawrence stuff was it still is, isn't it? Like I find that really interesting. So I don't know if you're thinking about looking at maybe what other kind of racial debates or stuff might have been going on around that time, but I don't know why I just went to that. So that was for that.
Yeah,
and then I could always
definitely.
something else.
So this forms a part of a wider thesis topic that was on representations of kind of northern working class and masculinity. And so, like, McFit.
Yeah.
Almost went out my head. I remember the way I was kind of reading these things at the time. It definitely felt as if so the recognition of kind of institutional racism the sense of kind of having a language of kind of terminology for how certain things had gone wrong in British race relations. This definitely to me seemed, and you can maybe frame it in terms of white backlash, a kind of attempt to sort of at times reappropriate that language of, they don't have, say, institutional racism, but they have kind of white working class decline, multiculturalism. It definitely feels like a kind of almost like taking some of that language that you get in the Macpherson inquiry. Hall has a great essay on the Macpherson inquiry that I can't remember the relevance of it precisely, but
of course he does.
Yeah. Well, I remember at the time making the sort of comparison in the thesis, which again, it's out of my head, it's a year gone.
No worries.
This sense of like something's gone wrong in British class life, and then it becomes the kind of white backlash attempt is to sort of reappropriate language and race to essentialize that, and it definitely feels like taking these positive progressive forms of naming things like institutional racism and then just kind of really cynically reappropriating.
There's no institutional racism.
Apparently there was a report last year.
Yeah, 2 years ago. Yeah, there's no institutional racism.
Yeah, we're all good. Fine.
We're fine. Absolutely fine.
It's the white working class with the
talk about being gaslit. You know what I mean, by the government. You know what I mean. Anyway, sorry.
Well, there's definitely a way of expanding it. Bringing that to bear back on this would definitely be useful. I've not thought of reintroducing that stuff as a case somewhere slightly different in the thesis, but it can definitely bring.
Because I think that because I know that because of the Met. Sorry, I'm hogging. I think a lot of institutions did do a bit of like reflection, didn't reflection on their own kind of positionality in that, but then like all of a sudden you've got. So I just thought I don't know why I got the connection, but there's something going on there.
I'll definitely consider bringing that to bear. It's definitely a way of expanding that sense of. I mean, the Klein article in the Daily Mail seems to be really kind of repugnant in how it frames. We've not listened to these people. They're the sort of backbone of the British working class.
But then the Daily Mail was like front and centre on Stephen Lawrence, though, wasn't it? So I find that really interesting.
I think the history of why they were though was really interesting.
Paul Dacre happened to have Stephen Lawrence's father in doing Decorated.
That
was it.
Yeah.
It was purely on a personal.
That's all it was. And it was he instigated it, and like otherwise it probably would have been
absolutely
same coverage.
I remember the one season. And I remember two very good instant reaction blogs in the days where blogging was really one by Mark Fisher and Kate
Cool.
And one by Richard Seymour when he was still doing Lenin's Tomb. Lenin's Tomb, Richard Seymour's response to the white season was exemplary. I was like, oh God, because I was looking at this. What's going on? Their response is very quick or very good.
I found a Mark Fisher one. I haven't encountered it, but calls Mark Fisher.
We got time for one more question. Did you have another question in the room?
Yes. I've got like a question each.
Okay, yeah.
If you see Dan, kind of following on from that actually, you seem really interested in the production side of it more than the audience response, but had you considered like audience responses outside of like academics? Sort of
that's another way. I mean, it's difficult to excavate now that kind of audience response 15 years on.
Or would you do like an audience project, maybe
show some, perhaps? It's difficult. Yeah, definitely. And I guess that's a way of reinvigorating that kind of legacy of it, which is now post-Brexit, post kind of like woke in particular. I was saying this yesterday. There's some of the promotion you could tell people on Newsday, like they must have they were grasping for woke before woke was there. Like when that term sort of became something they could utilise, like popping champagne, and it's like clearly. So reinvigorating and sort of bringing the sort of contemporary context back onto it would be useful, definitely. I was so it's come up. I've been asking people like, have they seen it?
Because even just that, I haven't seen them before. I was like, but it would give you so much data.
Yeah, maybe that is a way of sort of taking it forward.
Radio Times, let us see if there's anything.
Yeah.
That would be a good.
That's a good
Really,
one.
Yeah,
really
isn't
good.
it? Yeah, like when in doubt, Radio Times says for audience responses.
So if you had a second question for Chris, what's like the place of the unhoused in the show?
Absence.
Of course.
They don't feature. I mean, I think in one episode there is a reference to someone sofa surfing,
Yeah.
but
And that seems criminal of that.
yeah, but that's it. Then they're pretty much absent. And I do sort of mean it. That program exists. I can live with that. I can't live with the absence of. If you're going to take the housing crisis seriously, I know it's contextually tricky, and you can't do that in 6 minutes and unusual. But if you're going to devote 10 episodes to that, you can do that. You can. And it drives me mad that they don't. This is a public service broadcaster. Every time I'm critical of the BBC, it looks like I want to tear it down. I don't. I fundamentally believe in PSB. I want it to be much better. Yeah, but they're absent.
I find it really interesting that you have Michelle Ackley, person of colour. I find that super interesting doing something like that. But also grounding it like my parents lived in a camp,
Yeah,
isn't it?
Not that she.
Yeah, no, she did actually. Yeah, that's the
I
other
think
one.
that gives them credibility.
Yeah.
It's like, well, my parents
let's
were kind of
centre.
like, well, I grew up in a council estate, and I think that program's deeply problematic.
Yeah.
So, and she's like, I believe in social housing, but also I want to demonise people who
Yeah.
in any way maybe trying to slightly play the system. And it's like, well, A, why they're having to play the system? B, why is there shortage of social housing? No, we're not going to go into that.
Those questions are always
We're
going to
going
come.
to demonise these very particular people who are probably the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
And yeah, why isn't the BBC offering an alternative narrative to that?
And is it predominantly London-based, or do they go around the country?
Yeah, they go all over the place.
Right. Okay.
I mean, the episode, so season 1, episode 1, I think is around Kent. There's also
Right.
London, but there's a few cases in each one.
Oh, okay.
It's honestly, it's like a cop show.
It just plays
It's
it
a- it's a real cop show.
I was thinking of like when they go hunting for terrorists and spooks. That's
It was really authoritarian.
Yeah, it's authoritarian, it's cop show, it's drama, its use of music is problematic. Everything about it is like, oh my god.
the camera movement. Like, it's
Showing the picture of the woman, and it was like a kind of mugshot.
Yeah.
And then also, and it's all no colour, and it's like, did no one think that's really problematic? Was that the only person you could find who was scamming?
Yeah. Person of colour as well,
I mean,
isn't it?
like I said, I think the next layer is let's speak to the editorial, let's speak to production. How did they choose these studios?
Yeah.
How did they choose the participants? Because, wow.
But
imagine
surely
they
there's an
contact the
ethical
local housing
question
officers
there as well.
who
Is
are
it
happy
like
to get
the
help with the
council
BBC to
letting
do.
the BBC
I know.
run with them? It's like huge ethical question.
Incredibly dubious.
And like the safeguarding issues, surely, like.
I guess it gives a sense of like the dramatic agency of the council, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, this is
How
what
much do
we're-
they
this
get
is
paid
what
to
we're
let
doing.
BBC?
I mean, there's hours and hours of this. I think there's probably 40 episodes, maybe 38 episodes.
Wow.
I think it may have finished now. I should know that, but this was
And when did it start? Sorry.
2016.
Oh god, that makes it even worse.
So yeah, really late. This isn't like
Yeah.
it was up until a couple of years ago.
But the sooner shows that it's like can't pay, won't pay.
Yeah.
Pay lifts. I mean, who thought that? Let's commission some.
Can't pay, we'll take it away.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah. And there's a kind of poverty porn aspect.
Yeah.
Demonising of working class and working class. Right. I think in order for us to get a comfort break, unless anyone's got, maybe we can take any further questions out into the foyer. This is a really good time to say thank you to Chris and Dan. Wonderful papers. Really thought-provoking. So thank you for that, and thank you for our people online.
Thank you for being Chris Whitty, or not being Chris Whitty, the assistant to Chris Whitty.
I did my best. Right, I'm going to leave now, so thank you to, I think it was Christine who's online.